Trash is like 5 I mean, he's here.
He's here, but okay, he's walking up. Well, you know, he'll miss all my jokes, all my opening jokes. Okay. No lunch for this guy. Okay, I'll just say we're gonna let people come up. Yeah, there's a joker somewhere. It's an organic GPS system. Call your brother, call your uncle. Thanks for coming, everybody. I mean, it's sort of sad occasion, but I'm sure Dad would be very happy to see people and want people to, you know, enjoy themselves. He did have a good sense of humor. I'll get into that. I'll open by saying to the young people in the audience, encourage your parents to record family histories and their memories and such, because we've been finding that there's a lot of conflicting memories, and that, you know, amongst the brothers and cousins and so forth, there's a lot of things that one person knows and nobody else knows. I'll also mention, it's maybe a little too late. So there's a big gap in pictures. There's like high school, Army, and then sort of later, mostly later life, because my dad took all the pictures. So, you know, and so it's just not in that many pictures. Probably I don't, who took the ones in Wheeling? Was that?
My dad was the photographer.
Photographer.
I got pictures of him, but I got pictures of your dad.
Yeah. So, you know, get a few pictures of yourself, although, you know, okay, most of us are a bit long in the tooth. So I'll just mention one thing. My dad wrote up his memoir of his World War II service. There's arrows and signs. Oh, okay, sorry. And if anybody's interested, I can send you a copy. I took a few things out of it, mostly the more humorous elements. One thing I'll mention is, if you're a soldier in wartime Paris and you don't speak French and you try to find a place to sleep, you'll be sent to a place with young ladies and red velvet wallpaper. And he claims that he didn't stay there. So some lessons that he learned when he was in the Army. If it moves, salute it. If it doesn't, pick it up. If you're on the obstacle course and you're ducking under the barbed wire, keep your ass down and the sergeant will swat it. The medical exam for an Army is, if you can find the doctor's office, you pass the vision test. If you can get to the second floor, you pass the fitness test. He learned very early on, the Army serves green coffee. It's because they use canned milk, and he advised against drinking it. He played a lot of cards in the Army. I guess there's a lot of downtime. Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's high school. That's from his yearbook. Don't play poker with professionals, though, he said. I'm not sure, but I guess professionals, he meant just people who are a lot better than you. He also, you know, we all remember my mother driving the Checker. My mother and the Checker were sort of, you know, bonded together. But actually, he said when he was in the Army, somebody told him the Checker's the best car. So he actually, that's the origin of that. And then finally, I'll say Bazooka Men. Oh, so they said, do you want to be in the Signal Corps? And the Signal Corps means you have to carry a 30-pound radio on your back everywhere you go. So he opted out of that. However, he became a Bazooka Man. And he said the problem, the good side of that is you get lots of exercise, because every time somebody thinks they see a tank, they yell Bazooka Man, and you have to go running up to the front of the column, usually to be stopped halfway. No, false alarm. You know, somebody saw a horse or something. So if you think, you know, because my dad was hard of hearing, he didn't tell a lot of jokes. Yay, they made it. Hi, come and sit down. We just started. So I was just mentioning, I was threatening to tell this story. You know, we're sitting around. So Charles Patrick, Van Linden, and Berkeley Allen Lynch were all named after family members, ancestors. And about 10 years ago, I said, well, who was I named after? You know, Michael. I know Clark was from my mother's family, but who's Michael? And says, well, when you were born, it was the 1950s, and we were already calling your brother Pat. And in those days, the most popular jokes were Pat and Mike jokes.
That's so appropriate.
Yeah. Judith just said that's so appropriate, which that's now preserved for posterity. Yes. So it helps. It helps if you ever think you're maybe getting a little too egotistical, ask your parents some of the stories when you were a kid. So what we're going to do, we're going to ask some people to talk. Berkeley wants to go next, and we'll let people talk. And at the end, I'll say a few words, and we'll see how that goes. Tell a few stories and such. So I'm your MC. Think Joel Grey and Cabaret, but not as good looking or as talented. So, and everybody be sure. Yeah, you're Liza Minnelli. Yeah, it could be worse. It could be worse. So be sure you're speaking to the microphone, and we will have this. It'll be we'll have a recording of it, but also we'll try to get it up on the web later on. Okay.
Thank you, Mike. That's really great. Everybody, I'm so glad everyone could make it. Yeah, I should do that. Thanks. Judith is giving me advice on the mic. How's that? Can everyone hear me? Okay. First, I wanted to thank everyone for coming. It's wonderful to see everyone, and especially, you know, he died at such a terrible time in the country when we were going through the early stages of COVID, and you really couldn't gather and meet and remember people. So it's nice to do this. And Mike really was the key in organizing this. And he's also being the executor for both Bob and for Van. And so I want to acknowledge all the hard work he's been doing.
If anybody wants 64 acres in the middle of nowhere, West Virginia.
Yeah, for Pat and others. For Pat and anyone watching this, Mike's trying to pitch and sell the West Virginia land. I also wanted to take a moment and thank Josh. Thank Josh and Van, Josh's dad, of course, who passed away this summer, because they took care of Patrick, or of Dad, and they took care of Mom, and were just so important to us. And I know Dad really loved you guys, and really we all relied on you, and we really appreciate it. So thank you, and thanks for being here. Of course, I mean, everyone. I had a few comments about the early years. Is this the first slide of mine? Thanks. You've seen this already. This was the 70th year medal for being in the ACS, the American Chemical Society, that Dad got. So Bob was a chemist from high school era. He was really always interested in chemistry, and as soon as I think he went to college, he joined the ACS, and was always an active member, and did things and went to conventions. In 1942, the very first Westinghouse science talent search was done, which people have heard. I think it's changed to Intel, and I don't even know what it is these days, but it's become a much bigger thing. So in that first year, the way they organized it was they had winners from every state. And so there were, I think, 50, and they all gathered. And there's a couple pictures in there of them kind of meeting and having some nice social interactions, but I think a sign of his scientific talent and orientation. So I think in the next slide, so he had this science search that he won in 42, and then he actually started college briefly, and then went off to war. And so the Science Talent Search newsletter, we got this, and a copy of this from 1944. They would ask the previous winners to send in a little paragraph about what's going on with him. So he was in France at the time in the army. And so I have a little The next slide is his statement to the group. I think this represents his kind of wry sense of humor, kind of downplaying his adventures, somewhere in France, of course, little shrapnel, captured by the Germans, mild jokes about learning foreign languages because they make them useful. I just thought this was kind of amazing, and it reminds me, he was a very humble guy. He was very down to earth and humble, and had a wry sense of humor. And he was, I believe he was 17 and 42 when he did the award. So he was finishing high school and of course started college. And so this was at 19. He'd already been wounded, and of course he got, as Mike mentioned, got terribly wounded. And I think the Ardennes forest, the Hurtgen forest, I never remember that battle, and was on the death's door. He was shipped back to the US, months of rehabilitation. They weren't sure he was ever going to walk again. And he carried those scars. I remember seeing them his whole life, I'm sure both physically and mentally. But it was certainly a different generation of people who really had to go through insane struggles when they were young. He came back, got his master's in science, and ended up, he did a little teaching, which is where he met Mom. And I think the story Alice used to tell about this, and because we had this experience earlier where everyone had a different version of things, the story I heard was he was teaching her. So he was a teacher and she was a student, and it was a chemistry class, and she was like, I was terrible at chemistry. But he had already was having his deafness, because he was deaf most of his life since World War II. And he had learned a little bit about lip reading. And supposedly she leaned over to her female classmate and said something about how she'd like to get to know him a little bit better. And he wanders over and says, oh, hi. Did you say something you'd like to meet me? And that's kind of how they met.
No, she said, I'd like to experiment on him.
So there you go.
Repeat that for the record. Mike heard, she said, I'd like to experiment on him, which sounds about right. Yeah. I can hear her voice kind of saying that. And that's how they met. And, teachers and students in those days wasn't as big a deal, but I think they got married pretty quickly and started having children. Dad worked at pretty much, I think, most of his career at MCV, VCU as a clinical chemist, and really, I think, had an impact and managed the department in the end. I found, when he was actively working and I was growing up, he was always had a love of not just science, but of reading. And so the house was always full of books and full of science magazines, which I started getting interested in, and science books. And I still remember when I was like 14 or 15, he brought home, there was a new textbook in biochemistry, was a whole new thing, to have a textbook in that, because it was kind of a new field. And it overlaps with clinical chemistry, so he brought it back. And I actually still remember seeing that book because it was beautifully done. It had some great representations of proteins and peptides, and I got very interested. And I still remember it, and I became a biochemist in the end. And I think experiences like that were very formative. And I think quite a number of people in the room had experience with him around science, and him encouraging them to be interested in and learn science. I also remember doing things like when I was 14, he liked Heathkit, and Heathkit had the first electronic calculator kit, which had the TI chip that was a 4-bit chip that could do basic math calculations. So it was a calculator that could do like plus, minus, times, and division. And it was the size of a book, big book. And we assembled it, and all that stuff. So I would have those sorts of activities with him. He would also let me come to the lab, and I found it very interesting. They were, I think,
he did a lot of blood chemistry. So, you think you got to get your blood calcium measured, or your iron, or whatever it is. And so they were developing the automated instrumentation. And I saw in the 70s, there was instrumentation, these automated instrumentations that were pretty advanced for manipulating and testing blood samples and urine samples, and way ahead of their time. I mean, automation spread to the drug industry much later, really in the 90s and stuff. And I remember being involved in that. But so that was all very much an inspiration. And even on the clinical chemistry side of things, clinical chemistry, a lot of it is measuring things in blood or measuring things in urine. And later in my career, I got involved in clinical trials where I would do what's called biomarker work, which was, guess what? It was measuring things in blood. And so I would have these great conversations with him about on a very technical level about biomarkers and biomarker research. So he was just such a inspiration, but not pushy about it in any way, just a really encouraging education and science. So in generally his personality, as I mentioned, he was, I think, quite a humble person. He was very moral and generally quiet. And some of that was the deafness, especially later in years, got harder and harder to communicate, but always very mentally active. The last years, he also had a kind of, he'd suffered in his life. So he had a very, equanimous approach to life, I think, in a lot of ways. He tried to keep a positive attitude. He tried to not be thrown too much. He had a tough couple of last years, as Josh can attest to. And I still remember visiting him in those years and the last few years, and him saying, at bedtime, he had a phrase he would sometimes say, "Tomorrow will be better." And it both reflected that it had been a tough day, but that he was trying to be positive, I think, to the very end of his life. So we'll miss him very much, of course, and do miss him. And yeah, it's nice to gather and think of these things. And I'll end on Mike alluded to the different stories. I'm a little more humorous note. We were all sitting around at breakfast, and there was this one apocryphal story about the three uncles, Carlos, Conrad, and Bob, when they were children. When they were very young, Genevieve was in Mexico with them, separated from Charles Lynch, her husband, which was not uncommon. He was off in the field or doing what he did. And they were there for mineral prospecting or gas. Now Mike's gonna, if I get things like this wrong, I'm not gonna go into the details, but there was this interesting incident of she was on a train. Somehow she contacted it was an important Mexican general on the train. And she talked to the guy, and he seemed to like her. She got off the train, didn't get on, and the train was pulling away, and the general made the train go back for her. Now, we were sitting around and we had at least three versions of that story this morning. And it was very funny because we were all arguing about, no, I heard this. And, no, I heard this. And she left the baby on the train. She took the baby with her. So we were kind of chuckling about how memories and these stories change, and the memories aren't always true. And the other thing I learned about my father, I always thought he was a very steady guy, never had his wild moments. And this morning I learned that, they had some tough childhood, all the brothers, tough childhood moments where there's not much money, and they were separated and living apart from the family. And one of those times he'd been placed with a distant relative who apparently had a little side business in running moonshine and needed someone to drive the truck. And so Dad learned to drive a truck at 12 and was running moonshine for, I don't know, a little while until Grandma found out, his mom found out, and was like, what is going on here? That put an end to that, but that's a story I'd never heard. So we didn't always hear all these interesting stories of childhood. So he had a pretty remarkable life. So, all right, thanks. Thanks everyone for listening.
Someone else would like to come up? Josh, yes, please. Bob's grandson.
Hi, I'm Bob's grandson, Van's son. It's his second youngest. I'm never very good at these things, so I don't really have anything prepared. But I did spend the last. I lived with Bob for about the last 3 years, I think, of his life. And you know, I when my dad went back to he went to nursing school. You know, I think I was about 8. We moved back in. Well, he moved back in with them, and you know, I went with him. So I kind of grew up with Bob and Alice until I was, you know, into middle school, maybe high school. So I was pretty close to Bob and Alice, but I definitely got really close to Bob towards the end when I moved in and helped take care of him. And you know, I've heard, you know, so many stories, you know, from Bob at the, you know, after his wife Alice passed, you know, my girlfriend at the time, we would go over there every day and spend a couple hours with him just because he was so sad and just by that. And I had never even seen him shooken before. He was very kind of an unshakable, very kind of he was so even, you know, in his temperament and so just laid back and relaxed and of a person and had been through a lot, like, you know, as Berkeley was saying, you know, kind of grew up in tough times and lived through the depression and fought in a war, but he was very you know, even tempered. You know, I would say that's like the best way to describe him. He was just very down to earth and very humble. And yeah, so but you know, he was really shooken after that happened. And so we would go by there and you know, spend a couple hours every day with him. And, you know, over time, you know, he got better. You know, he was just very you would never know it by talking to him if you just met him. He was such a strong person, you know, he's such a tough guy. Like didn't but his personality would never let you know that, you know. But if you knew what he'd been through and just the things and you know after you know towards the end, you know, he lived to be 95, so or was it 94, 95? But you know, he every time something happened and he'd have to go through physical therapy, he really wanted to get better and he would just kind of push right through it and get better. He, you know, really bounce back a lot of times. And it was just, you know, it's very amazing. He never kind of let life defeat him or anything, you know, just and was always kind of you know, always seemed to be pretty happy with life. You know, he always seemed to be in good spirits. And he was quiet. And I think like Berkeley said, you know, some of that was due to his hearing problems. And he was kind of, you know, I think when you're very hard of hearing, you're sometimes a little bit in your head a lot, but he was also just a very like you know, just a humble person. And but you know, if you got him talking, he could tell some stories. And he really liked science. You know, he was very scientific minded, kind of a skeptic, very much a skeptic. And you know, um but I really got into a lot of, you know, science because of Bob. And I remember going down to the lab when he worked at MCV, and he was, you know, I was pretty young at the time, but, you know, I remember they were working with like bioluminescence, it was like firefly guts. They had it in a beaker, and he was showing me all this different stuff. But yeah, you know, we talked all the time. I've heard so many stories. He must have lived a really rich, full life, you know, very just filled with a lot of things because he had so many stories. You know, about the, you know, he told me a lot of story, a lot, most of the stuff I heard was, I guess maybe this is also just because of the types of things that I was interested in asking him, but we talked a lot about science, but he told me a lot of war stories and stuff too. I know one time he was like a bazooka man in the war. So, and I remember he said, I asked him if he ever shot a gun or anything in the war, and he was like, "No, I never shot a gun, but I shot at a tank once." He said, it was the only time he ever gotten, shot a weapon, but he said 2 tanks had come and actually cornered him by himself around the corner of a building, and he kind of shot at one and darted off. So it's a pretty wild story. And then, of course, he had the injury from the mortar and all that. And he did hit the tank, I think, but I don't think it did anything to the tank. So yeah, I don't think it damaged it.
So he explains in his memoir, he wasn't really trained and he didn't understand that the tank would stop before going into the crossroads. So he wasn't prepared to go around behind it. And if you hit the front of the tank, that's where the armor stick is.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. So, that was a cool story. And, he was, like I said, he was very into, like Berkeley said, he had all the, science, the science journals, medical journals, and also like, I guess you call them stuff like, not journals, but science news and different periodicals, I guess you call them. I don't know. But, and a lot of that stuff, I got really into reading that stuff, and it got me really into science. He always getting that stuff for years. And I know even a lot of that stuff, if you're not a scientist, a lot of stuff's very hard to understand. You're reading a science journal, but he read all that stuff and really tried to understand it and really enjoyed that. And, he was very also like Berkeley says, very, very moral person. He would get very personally upset by politics, I think. And he was a Republican lifelong, say he was but he didn't necessarily vote that way, depended, he was just a very moral person, and just would kind of go with his gut. And another thing about Bob is I never thought of him as an emotional person. Like you couldn't, when I lived with him as a preteen or as a teen or preteen, during that age, you're giving your parents hell. I was giving them hell. So I know I was a lot to deal with. So but it was mostly Alice that would do the reprimanding, or Bob did. We never really, he never really yelled at me or anything. It's just so kind of unshakable in that way. And but yeah, he was just very strong person. It really was. It does seem like people from that time, just something different about him, right? In his case, at least, anyway. He's a very special human and just went through so much in his life. And, I think he really, was happy with his life, at the end. And I miss him, and, he was a great guy. That's all I got. Yeah.
I guess I can add a couple of what do the MTV call them, pop-up notes. Dad was injured in the Hurtgen Forest, which was considered one of the great military fiascos because they sent all these soldiers in, and the trees were so thick the tanks couldn't go, so they just got bogged down for months in a horrible winter weather. And Dad was badly injured and sent home, and he didn't complain about it. Instead, he said, "I was very lucky. I missed all the bad weather." And if you want to know how unflappable he was, so in high school, I don't think I've told anybody this story for obvious reasons. Um, I was out one night. There was a club event, and it was late, and I was out in the county, and ran out of gas. And I actually had the AAA card on me, and I didn't even look in the wallet. And I called home and said, "What's the AAA number?" And he said, "We'll come and get you." And they came and got us, and they put gas in the car, and it wouldn't start. And this was the old one of the checkers. And in those days, you could actually open up the hood, take out, and we had to do this sometimes, take off the air filter and put some gasoline in the carburetor to prime it. So he did that, wouldn't start, did that, wouldn't start, did that, wouldn't start, did that, burst into flames. Me being cool, calm, and stupid in a crisis, slammed the hood down. Dad goes, "What are you doing?" I said, "I'm smothering the fire." He should have hit me upside the head, but he said calmly, "How do you think the car gets air when you're driving?" We put out the fire and found out later there was a leak in the fuel line or something. Anyway, someone else want to make some comments? Brian? Okay, I know Brian looks.
So it's amazing. So I don't picture Robert, Conrad, or Carlos as warriors, right? It's these wars do crazy things and affect us in ways I think that are generational, right? Likely our whole lives have changed because of it. It's sort of interesting. So I'm going to spin back a little bit. Robert is sent to Pittsburgh to live with my mom. That's how my mom and he got so close. So the way that happens is my grandfather gets a call and says, "Hey, there's a boy here at the train station with, and attached to his shirt, there is a pin and a note that has your name and address." That's how he gets to Pittsburgh. So he's sent there from wherever. So Sam goes and picks him up, takes him to their house, and stays for, I don't know how long, at least a couple of years, lived with them. So Robert's a bit bookish, right? Very liked to read a lot. My Uncle Harry, on the other hand, was, boy, like wrestle and fight and that kind of thing. So, and Robert was, by the way, I call him Robert, not Bob. I grew up, it's more formal. He was Uncle Robert, right? So one day he's sitting reading his book. Uncle Harry's taunting him, trying to get him to do things. So he looks up and he gets a bookmark, puts it in his book, closes the book, puts it next to him, and gets up, and they get in a fight. And he finally pins Harry on the ground and goes, "Have you had sufficient?" Which is a story, which is just perfect, right? So I think that was the only time they ever fought. That's the story my mom always told. So the way I got close with him was I lost my dad at 15. And so he was sort of my guiding star. So I always liked science stuff. Robert, he had this way of sending you books. So I always got these books that were, I wasn't the reader that you all are. But there would always be books that applied to where I was in my life at that time. In fact, he did the same thing with my daughter, Tesla. She has books from him, and a little squirrel that she wanted me to bring with, which you couldn't find it for today. Has a necklace there from Alice that actually Van gave her, which so she wanted me to bring it with her because she got sick yesterday and wasn't allowed to come. So I wrote letters back and forth to Robert through high school and college. I'd visit him anytime I could. I'd see him about twice a year. He'd either come see us or we'd go see him. I'd go see him at Tallheim when they finally got their place in Canaan Valley. So we spent hundreds of hours talking. I mean, just hundreds of just the two of us talking. And you had to talk, real direct. You had to get a bit in his face, and I even learned how to talk to him on the phone, which wasn't always easy, right? So you had to make sure you're on the right subject before you talked about the subject, right? And that's a good thing. But here's what I find interesting, and I find this, well, the most interesting part to me is no matter what I thought about or talked about, he could talk to me and tell me something I didn't know. And usually it wasn't data I didn't have, it was an analysis, it was a way of looking. And I got to tell you, every single time, and it got to the point where anytime if it's politics or something that's like, I'll call it a little bit fuzzy, it's not black and white information, I would call him, and every single time tell me something. And by the way, his kids are the same way. Drives me crazy. So anyway, I miss him very much. He means a lot, means a lot to me in my life. My life is different for having had the experience with him. So thanks.
Unfortunately, Kazuya and Amy couldn't be here, but they sent notes, and I'll just read them briefly. So Kazuya said, you know, she remembers so much how my parents were so welcoming of her. Although she had to mention one time I told Alice that Mike was a good cook, and she said, I'm a better one. I can't do the accent. Amy does the accent. Bob and my father were the same age and both participated in the war. Bob went to Europe to fight and got injured. My father was drafted at the very end of the war. He was not sent into combat, but assigned to digging holes for people to hide in from air raids. If he was a couple months younger, he would not have been drafted. But if he was a couple months older, then, he might have been killed. He told me that a group of men who were a couple months older than him were killed in a submarine, so he thought himself lucky. I think it is a miracle both Bob and my father survived the wartime. Mike was born and I was born. We met and Amy was born. And I'm very glad to be able to meet all of you Lynches and the extended family, and hope to see you soon at some happy occasion. So Amy says, hi, everyone. I'm sorry my mom and I can't be there in person, but I hope you are all well. I decided to take my dad up on his offer to read what I wanted to share about Bob. We all know that Bob was caring, thoughtful, and supportive. I miss him very much, and I could write so much about the impact he had on my life. However, I don't want to make you all listen to my dad talk for too long, because I'm sure he's doing plenty of talking already. And there's a little smiley face, not a winky face. So I'll just share my favorite memory of Bob. About 8 years ago, many of us were gathered in Richmond for Christmas. At dinner, we were all sitting around the large table in the condo eating roast beef, and a classic Lynch family argument broke out. I don't remember exactly what it was about, but it was probably a few of us loudly debating where some restaurant used to be 25 years ago. Somebody called out Lynch ball. That was the name of the new sport we had come up with, in which the players argue about the rules of the game for at least 20 minutes and may not actually end up playing the game. This was Bob's first time hearing the term, so he seemed confused. But my dad leaned over and explained Lynch ball to him. He broke out in a huge grin and laughed. Bob was not a man of big reactions, so the memory of him laughing out loud during Christmas dinner at how loud and argumentative his family is always makes me smile. Thank you all for listening to my dad as he reads this. Thank you as well to Josh for taking such wonderful care of Bob for many years. Lots of love to you all. So, and I'm sure she'll see it later. Would you like to? Yeah, please, Janet.
This is actually, in a way, not my memory, but it is my memory. And I say that because after Aunt Alice died, I went with Mom and Daddy to visit Bob. And was it you and your daughter, his great niece, were there? Is that what she is? And it was the most precious thing I saw was her and his love for each other. It was just the sweetest thing, and that's my special memory. I just thought it was so wonderful.
Yes, Rosman.
everybody. Rosman, one of the grandsons. Yeah, so for me, I think like Amy, a lot of the memories around Christmas, because we'd always, every year pretty much come up, you guys would be there as well, and we'd just be in the house. And I think for me, what everyone's talked about how strong Bob was, and like he was a quiet guy. But just like being in the house with him, there's kind of like this energy where Alice is running around cooking and telling you what you want to, what's going on. But Bob's just kind of sitting there, and he's kind of the anchor of the whole family. I feel like he was kind of everything revolved around him to a certain extent in his energy. And it was great growing up and having that kind of Christmas. It was a Lynch Christmas spirit, so it wasn't Hallmark exactly. A lot of a lot of energetic arguments as we've heard and everything. But he really felt like kind of a keystone in all the personalities and energies in that house. And everyone, also Alice, of course, but everyone, all the generations coming there and doing that every year was really special. And you could feel the energy and the kind of the way people, gravitated towards him because he was so steady, so smart, so, again, kind of like I don't know, a keystone in an arch or something in the family. So that's what that's my strongest memories of him is those Christmases growing up. So that's all.
Everybody, yeah, I'll put it down, I know. I'm just only saying this is not an important memory, but I just thought I'd share it because it's so different from everybody else. So it's a different side of Bob. I think I'm the only person who has shopping memories with him because when we'd come down in the winter, he never forgot that my birthday was early December. And he wouldn't send me something. He always said he and I would go shopping. And because he wanted me to pick out something. So often we'd go to the museum, and I would also talk to him about things in the museum that he might not have thought to look at or unfamiliar to him. And we go to the museum shop, or he would take me to, when he was more mobile, he would take me to little independent stores, and he pretended to be interested and he would look at things, and I always find little things. And to this day, I've got all these little household, like a special platter or a special something that he and I bought together. And I always think of him whenever I use those. So that's all.
Someone else? Milo, Robert? Yes, Robert. Who is not named after Dad.
Yes. In fact, when someone sees me and they say Bob, I have to turn around because I think he's standing behind me because I don't go by Bob. And so yeah, it's one of those weird things. And so I usually say, actually, if you call me Robert, I would appreciate that because my dad's name is Bob. And they go, oh, okay. Now, when I say my dad, I have a couple dads. I have my original dad, who was, I'm trying to think of the nice way to say this because this is being recorded, but since he's dead, this is okay. He was a terrible father, not a good dad. He did some good things, but in the overall, he was not a Bob Lynch. Bob Lynch was Bob Lynch. I met him when I was 14. I was really into science, loved math, loved all that stuff, loved to read. I came from a household where the only book in the house was a phone book. Let that sink in. It was awful. Not until my grandparents sent me an encyclopedia set where there were more books. My dad didn't read, my mom didn't read. It was weird. And then through various things, I met Bob. He taught a math class at the the school that Berkeley and Van and I went to. He was fabulous. I just loved listening to him talk, because it wasn't that he was teaching it. He was offering the gift of knowledge that he had that was not understood from a book. It was understood by actual use. So he actually felt he understood the math and the science that he was showing us. And so it was like a conversation. It was like, hey, this is really cool stuff. I use it all the time. Here's how we use it, right? Oh, it was awesome. Through a very long story, I ended up living there for several years, and found out what again, trying to come up with the right words, an actual loving family was like to be in. It was fabulous. Wonderful. To have a dad that not only took an interest in what I was interested in, but said, hey, here's some suggestions, like you, Brian. Here's a book to read, or here's a game to play, or and we would play games. He would say, hey, there's this game that I have. It's a try to figure it out logic game. He said, see if you can figure out how many combinations there are. And he'd hand me this game, and I'd go and I'd play with it and try to figure it out. And then we'd sit down and do it, and he'd always win, because he had already gone through and figured out all the different combinations and all the different, it was so awesome. And then I'd say, how did you do that? And he'd go, let me show you. And then it was more even, but he always won, because he was just, really, really smart. That was one of them. He was amazing. But I come from a unique perspective here, in that I didn't know him as a little kid growing up. I knew him as a teenager growing up. And I really appreciate all that he did, and all that he did that I didn't know that he did. Just let that sink in. What a wonderful, wonderful guy. I'm just sorry that I didn't know him earlier, but I sure am glad I got to know him when I did. I just, one thing that I don't know if anyone has really really touched on yet. When I think of Bob, it's impossible to not think of Bob and Alice. My parents got along, sort of, but they didn't love each other. The Bob and Alice that I saw, it was a unbelievable deep love and respect for each other. That was just astounding to me. Absolutely, absolutely amazing to see that. And to see that on an everyday basis, not just a birthday, or not just a celebration, or not just a, certain times, but it was always like that. And just, I have said to Bob many times when I've seen him, thank you for everything. And every time he'd look at me like, I don't know what you're talking about. I'm just being Bob, kind of thing. But that's who he was. He was a spectacular person that did the right thing. Always did the right thing. Even when you didn't think it was the right thing, what Bob was doing was the right thing. He was absolutely amazing. The world is a far superior place for having Bob Lynch in it. And it's a shame that we grow old and we pass on, but as long as we remember Bob and we transfer to others what Bob has transferred into us, then he will continue to live on. Okay.
Would anybody else? Yes, Milo.
I think that the Lynch family, as we've heard, can be quite boisterous, and I think there's a lot of like loud opinions. But I think Grandpa Bob was really he was the crucial part of that, because he was someone who was always incredibly thoughtful and thought out all of his words. And I think he was very intentional about when he wanted to talk and when he didn't. And I think that I'm definitely grateful to him for that, because I think without that, it would be a little bit too much. So I think he was really the person kind of keeping it all together in the big family gatherings and keeping it all in check. And I think like everyone's been talking about, he was, even though he was the quietest person in the family, I think he really was kind of the glue of the family, of the extended family in a lot of ways. Where even though he might not be telling anyone what to do, everyone would still be listening to him even without him having to say anything. And I think it was really beautiful how important he was, and I think he taught all of us that.
Quick thought. This is just a little anecdote that Robert's lovely story about Bob's brilliance with games. I used to play chess with him when I was younger, and I would lose and I would lose and I would lose and I would lose. I never won. But if there was some point years later we were talking about, and I stopped playing with him. At some point years later, we were talking about chess, and I said, "Yeah, you're really good at chess. We played so many games. I must have won at least one game, didn't I?" And he went, "Nope." I was like, "Oh." And the other thing I'll say is, of course, all the people he interacted with, grandchildren, children, everyone, he's always very proud of them. And he would always, when we'd see him and I hadn't been in touch, he'd be telling me stories about Robert or about Brian or the different kids. And it was, so everyone here, I think, touched him as well as him touching them. So it's nice we have this moment together. So now I'll say.
Yeah, Dad was very skilled at math, and I always remember he was always trying to teach us lessons about math and practical math. And I do recall he bought us a roulette wheel, a toy roulette wheel when we were little. And, like, why would he do that? I wondered later, and I realized it taught me about probabilities and randomness, but also you can't win. You can't beat the roulette wheel. But I had a great moment in high school. He always said, if you need help with math, come to me. So I was taking calculus, and there was this derivative that I could not figure out. And I went to him and he said, "I can help you." And he looked at it and he looked at it and looked at it. And he went in the library and he pulled up this beat up old paperback, and it was full of mathematical formulas and equations. And he found the solution to the derivative. So of course I went in very proudly. Nobody in the class got it but me. And the teacher, Ms. Diamond, was like, okay, show us how you did it. I said, simple. I asked my dad and he gave me this book. But, I'll say, my mother in her later years had a lot of physical discomfort, and my father took care of her. He was just very devoted. I remember my mother's friend used to comment that he was a saint because basically she was unhappy and complaining a lot, even as he took care of her, but he was unfazed. And it makes me think of the book, The Greatest Generation by Tom Brokaw. Excuse me. He said, these men and women came of age in the Great Depression when economic despair hovered over the land like a plague. They had watched their parents lose their businesses, their farms, their jobs, their hope. They had learned to accept their future would play out one day at a time. They came home to resume lives enriched by the values they defended. They stayed true to their values of personal responsibility, duty, honor, and faith. No fanfare is required. They've had their parades, they've heard the speeches, they know what they've accomplished, and they are proud. No block of marble or elaborate edifice can equal their lives of sacrifice and achievement, duty and honor as monuments to their time. I remember we were traveling to West Virginia once and I was driving. This was not that long ago. And Dad just commented, I'm not sure if I was a good father because I didn't really know my own father. And I said, well, I don't have any other example, but boy, you sure did a great job with us, I think. I sure hope he feels that way, so thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Go by size. Oh, good. No, thank you. Oh,
Well, what's best?
Getting close.
Gwen, come on.
I know, I
Yeah.
was trying to speak in.
Everybody, some people bend their knees. Oh, thanks. I'm sorry. I said come to the table.